What's going on here, my friend?
Hello, in this video I want to analyze the movie Red Dawn from 1984. The movie was directed by a director I actually respect, John Milius. He was the director of Conan the Barbarian. But in this video I want to analyze what makes this movie propaganda and how the geopolitical landscape actually shaped this movie, and why was this movie being produced precisely when it was in the early 1980s. Well, this movie, in my opinion, is definitely a consequence of this idea that became popular in the late 1970s, and that is that America is on the decline, that the American empire is falling, and that the Soviet Union is actually winning the Cold War. And looking at that perspective today, we see that it was actually a paranoid perspective, and that only extreme right-wingers and extreme leftists actually truly believe that one day the Soviet Union will be as powerful as it was in this movie. But okay, let me explain why the American political elites, especially those on the right, were so paranoid about the Soviet Union suddenly becoming more powerful than America. Well, in the 1970s, America lost the Vietnam War. That destroyed the American morale, and it also really did appear that at least in the third world, communism was winning. There was a communist revolution in Angola, in Mozambique, in Ethiopia. Afghanistan also had its own communist revolution. Then in Grenada, the communists won. In Nicaragua, finally the communists won against the American ally, the horrible Somoza family, and there was this fear that the communist revolution will spread all across Southern America and Central America, and that Mexico will also perhaps become communist due to the oil crisis of 1982. But the irony is that that same oil crisis actually ended up destroying the Soviet economy and causing the Soviets actually to win. And there was also this great fear that Europe will abandon the United States in the hour of the greatest need of the United States, and that fear is to an extent shared by a portion of the right-wingers today that are anti-NATO. But in this movie, what happens? The Green Party wins in West Germany, and in the early 1980s, the Green Party truly did for the first time enter the German parliament, and the Green Party did sympathize, at least elements within the Green Party did, with communism, and they were anti-NATO. And so this movie also reflects some real fears that existed among the American people, perhaps mostly among the political elites. And so West Germany leaves from NATO. This causes the NATO alliance to crumble. America is now alone. All the other countries except for Great Britain have left NATO. And there is also a communist revolution in Mexico, and the Soviet Union attacks at the same time both from Alaska and from Mexico. And America now has to deal with this double offensive, and of course the Cubans, the Nicaraguans, the communists from El Salvador, that in this scenario becomes a communist country, all of them attack the United States. Well, this scenario simply isn't realistic, and I'm going to explain why. So I watched a documentary about this movie, and I was told that John Milius actually asked the American military analysts to conceive a scenario in which the Soviet Union could attack the United States. And okay, perhaps if all of these things happened, if Mexico became communist, if NATO crumbled, yeah, perhaps communism would be powerful enough to attack the United States. And what also needs to be mentioned, one important thing happened throughout the 1970s. America, immediately after the war, the World War II, used to be 50% of the world economy, because the rest of the world simply destroyed itself to such an extent that America was 50% of the economy. But with the rise of Germany, West Germany and Japan and the Soviets and some other Asian countries like South Korea, the percentage of American share within the world economy declined, and America in the 1970s was only 25% of the world economy. And that also led to this feeling that the fall of American empire is near. And today also many share this concern, but I wouldn't be so frightened if I was American about this happening, because we know that on the contrary, America did not only not fall, but the Soviet Union actually fell. So this movie largely captures this irrational fear. Definitely from the perspective of today, we can say irrational fear that America is on the decline and that the Soviets are somehow winning. And that is why I would say that this movie is definitely propaganda, because through propaganda, in my opinion, presents an unlikely scenario as likely. It also often portrays an unjustified fears that exist in the population as being justified, or presents them as being real. In the same way, Eisenstein, the famous Soviet propagandist director, used to produce films that were anti-kulak, anti-rich peasants, and in these movies peasants would hide grain from the Soviet state. And now, of course, were some peasants hiding grain. Some of them were, of course, but not as many as Stalin thought, and Stalin saw sabotage at every corner of the Soviet Union. So this movie, Eisenstein's movies, served to reinforce Stalin's fears, the fears that were shared by many hardliners in the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And in the same way, this movie embodies fears shared by many on the political right, such as John Milius in the United States. But two additional factors make this invasion even more unlikely than than it is. So even if we go with this scenario that we are presenting in this movie, there are still two elements that are very unrealistic. Well, the first one is this idea that the Soviet Union even wanted to attack the United States. I mean, maybe some crazy demagogue comes to power in the Soviet Union and declares a war on the United States, but ever since Stalin defeated Trotsky, the Soviets never even dreamed of spreading communism to the United States. I mean, unlike Trotsky, Stalin did not believe in the permanent revolution. He believed in socialism in one country, and he famously said that communism, if it spreads anywhere, it will be in China. Stalin realized that communism will not, like Marx intended, spread to developed economies of West Germany, England, France, the United States. And he realized that feudal despotic countries are actually much better for the spread of communism, due to the people actually being severely oppressed, and that made the revolutionary ideals of communism, like anti-racism, wealth redistribution, and stuff like that, that attracted the masses in such societies to communism. And to Stalin it was obvious that in the United States the workers simply aren't as oppressed as they were in Russia or Vietnam, China. So yeah, the Soviets didn't even want to attack the United States. And other than that, well, what's kind of funny to me, the first thing that the Soviet troops do in this movie is they start massacring American children in schools. But Gavril Popov, a respectable liberal Russian historian, he's actually anti-Putin, he argued in his book that the Soviet people, they never genocided the Germans, definitely not in the same way in which the Germans genocided the Soviets. So even massacres of German children were not something you could often see during the Soviet occupation, and that's what makes this idea that Soviets would just nonchalantly start killing American children. That's what makes it, well, propaganda, and that's what makes it so bizarre. Although now let me end with some good things about this movie. Now I've explained why this movie is propaganda, why it was made when it was made, so in the period when American economy, at least when we look at its percentage in the world economy, was declining, with the communist revolutions in Grenada that happened in 1979, and also in Nicaragua. The Sandino movement won, and the Iranian revolution was also something that disturbed the Americans. It happened in the same year. So yeah, it was this decline, or perceived decline, of the 1970s that made John Milius, that made him want to produce this movie. But okay, what are some things that actually do make sense and that are very good about this very flawed movie? Well, what I liked is a dialogue between a Mexican communist and, I believe, a Cuban communist. The Mexican general says, well, what I've learned as a revolutionary is that you can't win until you actually have the people on your side, and that's why this occupation, we will not be able to hold American soil if we do not win the hearts of minds of the American people. And this, in some interpretations, was actually a subtle critique of American foreign policy, although, yeah, that seems unlikely. It seems to be a critique of Soviet imperialism, in this movie at least. And what I also find interesting is that, yes, the Soviets, they definitely would interpret some things just as they did in this movie. For example, there is a scene in which two Soviet soldiers are talking about Indians and looking at the monuments of American battles with the Indians, and they are of course saying, that is when the imperialists oppressed the native population, and then they established the centers that are called the Soviet-American Friendship Centers, which, that's what's so funny to me about communism. Even as they are conquering other lands, they insist on the quote-unquote fact that it's all about friendship and universal brotherhood between the nations. But okay, all in all, yeah, I was mostly interested in explaining why this movie was produced, exactly when it was, and in what ways is this movie propaganda. And well, one other major way is that this movie glorifies also the Second Amendment. The Americans are able to defeat the Soviets by precisely because of the Second Amendment, because they are armed. And in that aspect, this movie really reminds me of communist propaganda movies that were very popular in Yugoslavia. So in this movie, non-trained guerrillas are able to kill hundreds of trained soldiers, which is something that often happens in communist propaganda movies. But okay, I simply felt the need to point out the obvious way in which this movie was propaganda. But okay, that's all for this video, and don't forget to like, share and subscribe if you liked this video.